Hey, folks, welcome back to Processing Blue. I am your host and Panthers beat reporter, Mike Kaye, joined by my fellow Panthers beat reporter, Alex Zietlow. Alex, I know we see each other a lot during the summer, but how was your summer, my man?
Oh, my summer was great. Are you sure we see each other enough? We be talking on the phone a lot. We're texting a lot, but are we seeing each other face to face? Are we getting that good quality time that's necessary? If you couldn't tell, I'm a little punch drunk after this first availability of training camp, but I'm ready to go. I'm excited to see you, man.
In short, the answer is yes. But we are coming to you live from Bank of America Stadium on Tuesday, shortly after Bryce Young, Jadeveon Clowney, GM Dan Morgan spoke to us. The local media also got a tour of the new practice grounds just outside of Bank of America Stadium. Veterans have reported. Everybody, for the most part, seems to be in. We're about to start another journey with a new GM and a new head coach at the helm in Carolina. And it didn't feel like too long ago, Alex, you were a new beat writer covering a new head coach. Now you're still sort of new.
Yeah.
And there's a new head coach in Dave Canales here. We've been off for quite some time. Don't worry, we won't leave you hanging again anytime soon. We're going to be with you all throughout training camp. But Alex, let's get into this because, there's a lot to cover here. I did the math today, and we all know I'm a journalist, so math is not my strong suit. I had to count 7 times. There are 40 new faces on this roster that were not on the practice squad or the 53-man roster at the end of the season. 40.
That's remarkable.
40. There's a 90-man roster. Dear Lord, that's a lot of turnover, and rightfully so. This team was 2-15 last year, worst record in the league. It was necessary. So now you got a new GM in Dan Morgan, who obviously has the history of the team surrounding him, was a player here, was a standout player, and then obviously worked his way up the front office ladder. We've well documented that on charlotteobserver.com. They hired Dave Canales, his buddy from Seattle. He brings in a bunch of his buddies from Seattle as well as Tampa Bay. Oh, by the way, Ejiro Evero, his defensive staff still here. But I think when we talk about this offseason, we talk about the additions, the new faces, right? And so they've made several roster moves. Who are the 2 biggest additions, in your opinion, to this Panthers roster?
Well, what you say about teams down, and when you really the saying goes, when you lose everything, that paves the way for transformation. And that's something that Dan Morgan kind of hinted at in his opening press conference. He was like, people were asking about what is this team's identity going to be? And he was like, well, we got a lot of new faces. It's up to them. And you asked about my favorite additions to this team coming up. I really think there's one. There's a second guy that I'll throw out there if you are cool with me having 2. But the one that kind of stands out among the rest is Jadeveon Clowney. He is a veteran edge rusher, this pass rusher who's just coming off of his best season to date, really. And he's 31 years old. He's got this whole storyline of coming back to the Carolinas. He's a Rock Hill native, so this is his hometown NFL franchise. And also he's funny. He's charismatic. He's got this star power quality that I think the team lost a little bit as the defense atrophied, as Brian Burns left, as Dante Jackson, always a funny voice in the locker room, left. He brings that star power quality. I will also say we talked to JD today, and one thing that he reiterated is, I'm a winner. The Panthers and their leadership and Dan Morgan have said, hey, this is a long-term build. Hey, if we're disciplined with our plan, we will have a winning product in maybe not this year, but next year, and if not the year after that. We asked Clowney what this team is capable of this year, and he's like, wait, what do you mean? We're going to win this year. Like every team that I've been on has won. And I think that's pretty interesting. I think that's confident. I think that is kind of his shrugging candor is kind of who he is. And also, just to fact check him, he's been in the league for 10 years, been on 6 different teams in those 10 years. He's only had 3 losing seasons. Those 3 seasons, 4-12 Texans, the 8-9 Browns, and the 7-10 Browns. And the 7-10 Browns were in 2022. Followed that up with a 13-4 team where he played on the Baltimore Ravens last year, and they were a touchdown within beating the Chiefs in the AFC Championship game. So when he says he's a winner, he kind of the personalities that have been added to this team, I think, provide a window into how these fans can really fall in love with this team. And not to say that it was lacking last year, but I think that was something the fans were craving. Someone who can just like be appointment television, appointment viewership, appointment social media ship, I guess, in today's world. So Xavier definitely provides that. And if he can provide equally compelling stuff on the football field, then all the better.
Well, and we can't just all be positive, right? This team was 2-15 after all. There's a lot of heavy lifting to do.
Mike, watch me. Okay.
I mean, I know you got to take it down a little bit there, kiddo. But I think we do need to talk about the biggest area of concern. And while last year the offense was pretty much horrific, I think it's fair to say that the organization went into the mode of benefit the offense even at the loss of the defense. And I think when I look at the biggest area of concern on this team, I look at cornerback. And not because of the talent there, but because of the history of the talent there. J.C. Horn is the number 1 corner in this league. He is very, very good. He's played in 22 of 51 career games because of injury over the last 3 years. That's a problem. It's a lack of dependability there. They say that the best attribute you can have is being durable in the NFL. And they brought in Dane Jackson, a guy that Dan Morgan is familiar with from Buffalo. He kind of pounded the table for him when he was coming out of the draft. They have Troy Hill, who is in his early 30s, proven nickel corner, cool, whatever. Then they have a bunch of guys that you probably have never heard of unless you are a sicko or you read charlotteobserver.com because,
Or both.
I mean, you probably are if you're listening to this podcast, right? They draft Shaw Smith-Wade, who is a versatile corner who's kind of learning the nickel position. He's going to start training camp on the PUP list. You look at DiCaprio Boodle, who I call Shutter Island. Look that one up if you don't get the reference. We don't have time for this. Brevity is important, I've been told. But what I would say is like they have a bunch of corners who kind of shined in limited action last year, and DiCaprio Boodle and Deshaun Jameson. But you can't just depend on that. The problem here is Dane Jackson is a guy who makes sense as like a solid number 2, or like kind of like you bring it up a lot in baseball, like a replacement level player. And that's fine. A lot of teams there aren't 32 great corners in the league, right? But the problem is when you have a corner that is injured as much as J.C. Horn, the cascading down effect is that a guy who's kind of a replacement level corner could be your number 1 corner, like after one hit, you know what I mean? Or like one pulled hamstring. And I think that's a concern. So I think they need to bring in more competition there. I know you brought up Jadeveon Clowney earlier. What's your thoughts on the edge rusher position? Because I think that's an area of concern for both of us.
Yeah, no, that is the area of concern I was going to hit on. I was about to say, how can we go through this entire segment without mentioning a position group on the offense? But I guess that's what we're going to do. The thing about the pass rush that is really concerning is there needs to be long-term planning there. Again, Clowney does want to win here, and he has proven that he's at the top of his game with the 9.5 sack season he put together last year. But outside of him, you got another kind of veteran, not a veteran, but also not a youngin either, and DJ Wanham, who is on the active/physically unable to perform list to start training camp with a quadricep injury. You also got Amari Barno, who is also on the active/PUP list to start training camp. So the long-term and the short-term plan at the pass rushing position is not ideal right now, and of course it wouldn't be ideal after you lose Frankie Louvu to free agency last year, after you lose Brian Burns in a trade last year that really needed to be done. There was really no way of getting around that. So it's completely understandable, and it's completely, and it's potentially manageable as well, but that is an issue. That is a position of concern for sure.
Well, we just talked about the pass rush. It wouldn't be an episode of Processing Blue if we didn't talk about the passing game. And I think Bryce Young.
Wait, who? Bryce Young?
Yeah, you might have heard of him. He's a guy that has kind of gone under the radar from the sense of he's a first overall pick, a quarterback who's coming off a terrible rookie season. It was terrible. I'm sorry. Every metric was terrible. Whether it was all his fault or not. I mean, I think he got off a little lightly in that we all saw what was going on around him and said, this is his ecosystem that is failing him. He had his quirks, but in reality, he's going to have to be the guy that steps up. When you're drafted first overall, the expectation is that you grow at a rapid rate. You can run an NFL offense and perform.
You can put an offense on your back, so to speak.
Right. So I guess, we're not going to know what really is to come of Bryce Young's year 2 until he actually gets into action in the regular season. But I guess from a training camp space, what do you want to see from him this summer, first and foremost?
It's kind of difficult to measure this when I say this, but this is what I want to see. I want to see Bryce Young processing speed. We've talked a lot about how Dave Canales, head coach Dave Canales, wants Bryce to receive the snap, step back, and get the ball out in 2.7 seconds. And a lot can happen in 2.7 seconds. And that's something that Bryce didn't do a great job of last year. And whether that was because receivers weren't getting great separation, whether that was the interior offensive line was an injury-laden offensive line was crumbling right in front of him. Whatever the case may be, he wasn't getting the ball out fast enough. And that did yield some interesting plays that we learned that Bryce was tough. We learned that Bryce was shifty and fast and all these things. We got to see a couple splashes of the dazzle that he showed at Alabama. But like in order for this offense to work, Dave said it from day one, they need to find plays where Bryce is comfortable getting back, planting that foot, and just firing in 2.7 seconds. How do you see that in training camp? I don't know. That will probably be most evident when the New York Jets come to town to punctuate training camp August 15. But that's what I want to see. Mike, what about you?
Well, I think from the standpoint of, so when he was drafted, we went to rookie camp, and he looked like, as I call him, Bama Bryce. He was throwing the ball down the field. He was improvising. And then something happened between OTAs and training camp where it was almost like they told him not to throw the ball more than 15 yards in front of him. And that carried on into the regular season. Like I've written about this. I've talked about this on other podcasts. Every training camp, session or week, I dropped them a win in their record last year because it was, and even then I was being a little too confident, I guess, in my projection. So what I want to see from Bryce Young is consistent accuracy down the field. This offense, in order to move, they have to find consistency in complementary football. We know that Dave Canales has said he wants to run the ball consistently.
Be stubborn about it.
Right, but when you run the ball and hopefully you're picking up 4 yards a carry, you then want to be able to take advantage of stacked defensive boxes and throw the ball downfield. You want to be able to test safety coverage down the field. You want to be able to use Deontay Johnson running a go route down the field and beating guys with speed. You want to use Xavier Legette to win jump balls. You want to see whatever Jonathan Mingo is able to add to the fold. This needs to be an offense that has some explosive plays because there was nothing explosive except for the amount of sacks that Bryce Young took last year when it came to the passing game. And something you look at, the lack of production at wide receiver, Jonathan Mingo, the second-round pick, who was asked to start 14 games, appeared in 15. He had 418 scoreless yards last year. Guess what? Bryce Young was sacked 62 times for a loss of 477 yards last year. That's more than the kid put up in receiving yards last year. his number 2 wide receiver. That's an evident problem. And so I think you need to see some explosion here at wide receiver, at tight end, where Tommy Tremble has proven that he is a very good athlete. Ja'Tavion Sanders, they draft him. We'll get into the rookie class in a second, but like there are more weapons here. Like I'm not trying to say like Bryce Young's out of excuses because I think that's a ridiculous statement to make, especially without seeing all the pieces in play. But he's got to push the ball downfield. This can't be a dink and dunk offense to be successful. We saw with Baker Mayfield and Tampa Bay last year, it seemed like he always had a cheat sheet to the quiz. So his first read was covered. Oh, he knew to go, down the seam, if his first route was covered on the outside. Like it almost seemed like he had all the answers to the test on offense. And that helped him because he is limited, as we've saw when he was in Carolina, as a quarterback. So I think for Bryce Young to follow suit, that would be the best possible outcome heading into this season.
100%.
So I brought up the rookie class. We've talked about Xavier Legette. I want to talk about the group as a whole because ultimately this is the short-term and long-term solutions to a lot of things, right?
Sure.
Let's go over the class really quick.
Okay.
First-round pick, Xavier Legette. Second-round pick, Jonathan Brooks, the running back out of Texas.
A first-round pick, by the way, who the Panthers traded into the first round to obtain, which was considered like a crazy thing heading into the draft. But then it kind of aged kind of well because now you're like, okay, we got the guy we want. Plus, the Panthers secured a 5th-year option for him. All right, so sorry, go ahead, Mike.
You done? You
oh
done?
Oh my goodness!
I'm just kidding. Anyway, we'll get to him. I'm just going down the list, man. Okay, I know you're super stoked. Hashtag super stoked. Trademark Mike Kaye. So first round pick, Xavier Legette, wide receiver out of South Carolina. Running back, Jonathan Brooks, running back out of Texas. Hashtag super stoked. Yes. Thank you to our producer, Zach. Third round pick, linebacker from Kentucky, Trevin Wallace, who I am actually very excited about. He really impressed me with his athleticism during OTAs. Fourth round pick, tight end Ja'Tavion Sanders, who came from Texas as well and is one of the biggest talks of the draft Twitter, draft X community. 5th round pick, Shaw Smith-Wade, who we mentioned earlier as part of the cornerback depth chart. He comes from Washington State. 6th round pick, Jaden Crumedy, who comes from Mississippi State. He's a defensive lineman who Alex wrote a very nice story about after he was drafted. And then the 7th round pick to wrap it all off, Michael Barrett, another linebacker from Michigan. Let's talk about this rookie class. I think when you look back at last year's class, it was almost set up to fail because there weren't enough lottery tickets. They had a 5-man draft. Bryce and Mingo were forced onto the field for pretty negative results, one would say. DJ Johnson, their 3rd round pick, who they traded up for, Chandler Zavala, who they drafted in the 4th round, and Jamie Robinson, who they drafted in the 5th round. All 3 of those guys don't have clearly defined roles, and they're all battling to stay around. Even Jonathan Mingo's trying to figure out his role. Right. Bryce Young's the only guy with a defined role. So what I think when you look at what Canales wants to do in long-term thinking and what Dan Morgan's trying to build from a roster standpoint is he's got guys in place when other guys are about to leave. You look at Deontay Johnson, who we brought up. He's in a contract year. Adam Thielen's 33. They have a guy who can immediately become an alpha in a year in Xavier Legette. Mm-hmm. Chuba Hubbard is in a contract year, and Miles Sanders is, coming off a regrettable season. Mm. They've got their built-in successor there in Jonathan Brooks. Yep. At linebacker, Josie Jewell and Shaq Thompson are both on the opposite side of 30, and Shaq Thompson's in the final year of his deal. Oh, look, here's Trevin Wallace and Michael Barrett ready to take over in a year, potentially. Crumedy, another guy who adds youthful depth. Shaw Smith-Wade, we mentioned how old Troy Hill is and the fact that Dane Jackson is kind of like a fringe starter. I like what they've done with this rookie class. I think there's a lot of optimism there. I also trust Dan Morgan as an evaluator. He was very good in Buffalo, got rave reviews from everybody that I talked with around the league once he got hired. So I think that there's a lot of optimism there. My concern is, are these guys going to get enough playing time initially? Because they're kind of stuck in this push and pull. And we talked to Dan Morgan about this today, about expectations for the playoffs. He doesn't want to put any expectations out there. So there's going to be all this competition. I'm just hoping that you can see some of these guys like Jatavian Sanders, who in my opinion is more of a slot receiver, a big slot receiver than a tight end. I'm interested to see how he could maybe play into Adam Thielen's playing time as opposed to Tommy Tremble, who is a young guy who, by the way, is in a contract year. And, oh, by the way, there's a replacement potentially for him on the rookie class. What are your thoughts kind of summing up that rookie class? I know I kind of rambled on, but what are you thinking? What's your outlook on that class?
I guess the one thing that I could and want to add is going into the draft, Dave Canales and Dan Morgan were both like, we are not concerned with plugging in guys from this draft class onto the field immediately. We are concerned with getting the best available talent and then hopefully developing them and hopefully like figuring out their place in our organization in 2 years, in 3 years, in 4 years. And the way you beautifully laid it out, Mike, it kind of sounds like the chips fell pretty ideally when it comes to, okay, we both know that our inside linebackers are getting up there in age. Well, the two best players on the board when we drafted them in the later rounds, they were both linebackers. I just think that the symmetry there was good, and it seemed like it was a little too good to not be purposeful. So there's definitely some long-term planning going on. It started this spring in April at the draft, and it's only continued throughout the rest of the preseason. Mike, you want to talk real quick about an under the radar player this year?
Yeah, you know me. I like deep cuts. I like guys that like those underdog sort of dark horse guys.
I imagine that's why you like me, right?
Yes, of course. I mean, you know, who knows where we got you? You kind of came out of nowhere.
Came from Rock Hill, same place as Jadavian Clowney. Anyway, continue.
Wow. Alex has got his diva kind of gear on, you know, full blast. Anyway, a guy I want to talk about, I mentioned him earlier in the show, DiCaprio Bootle. He did a really nice job in Chicago when getting some extra reps. I think he's in a really good position if they don't add to the group to be that fourth corner. And that fourth corner spot is really important when you consider J.C. Horn's injury status, right? Mm-hmm. Like everybody kind of slowly goes up the ranks when J.C. Horn's down. And I think Bootle got injured in the middle of the season. He was a really good special teams player. Chris Tabor loved him. I think he's very competitive and feisty as a defense player. Plus, I gave him a great nickname. So obviously I want to be able to use that at any point, you know, down the road.
Fantastic.
But is there an under the radar guy for you? And if there is, why do you think that player who maybe was here last year can stick out more than just being a special teams player?
Yeah, well, the guy, I mean, your question set me up beautifully. The guy that I was going to roll with was Ihmir Smith-Marsette. He was this kind of gadgety player for the Panthers last year. He lined up at receiver, on the outside in the slot. He was the punt returner. He scored the only touchdown against the Bears for the Panthers when they went up to Chicago on that punt return. That was electric. He is, I mean, I feel like I'm kind of repeating myself. Maybe I just gravitate to the guys who are like real interesting and aren't afraid to let their bravado show. But he's this guy who brings a lot of like fun personality to the wide receiver room. He's on the smaller side, so he's not going to be this physically imposing Xavier Legette, DK Metcalf type. But he's fun. He's fast. He was kind of one of the few interesting and unpredictable spots on this offense last year. An offense that was just dripping with predictability. So I'm looking for him. We haven't really talked about him that much in this offseason program. I think that he can do some fun things.
One fun fact before we
have
move
a lot of fun on this.
So last year around this time, both DiCaprio Bootle and Ihmir Smith-Marsette were in Kansas City on the Kansas City roster.
Right.
DiCaprio Bootle was claimed off waivers. Amir Smith-Marset was traded for at the cutdown deadline.
Right.
I would look for activity like that to happen this year, especially with the Panthers having the number one priority on the waiver wire for the first few weeks of the season. Also, by the way, Dan Morgan was credited behind the scenes with not discovering, but identifying both Boodle and Amir Smith-Marset as rosterable talent. So they have a little bit of an in with Morgan. And on that note, wrap us up. Take us home, A to Z.
All right. On that note, let's take us out. Thanks, as always, for listening to our pontifications on all things Panthers. Please subscribe and follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts by searching Processing Blue. And if you watch us on YouTube, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and click on the bell icon to get notified whenever new episodes drop. And finally, please be sure to stick to charlotteobserver.com for all your Panthers needs. Stay humble, stay creative, and keep processing.